Erich Brandenberger and his Seventh Army were like poor relations from whom the patriarch of the family expects big things, but to whom he provides little material assistance. Adolf Hitler expected the Seventh Army to protect the southern flank of his offensive, all the way from the German frontier to the Meuse River, a distance of about 80 miles, and to do it with a parachute and 3 Volksgrenadier divisions, dependent almost entirely on horse-drawn transport. Assuming the Seventh Army reached the Meuse and aligned its 4 divisions to hold equal portions of the south flank, that would mean a defensive sector for each division of 20 miles, which could hardly be considered much of a barrier to a counterattack from General Patton's Third Army to the south. Yet Hitler was paying scant heed to the south flank, for he was counting on surprise and speed to get the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies across the Meuse before the Americans could counterattack, so that he expected the first American riposte only after his troops got beyond the Meuse. At that time he figured Eisenhower would be too concerned about stopping the forward thrust of the offensive to pay much attention to its flanks. Hitler's senior field commanders saw it differently. They all were well aware of the tactical dictum that had emerged from the Great War and long been taught at the Kriegsakademie, a dictum with which American commanders were also familiar, for it had been taught too through the interwar years at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The way to deal with an enemy penetration is to hold tight at the shoulders to deny any widening of the penetration and to limit the force the enemy can project in his forward thrust. Once the lines are stabilized, cut off the penetration at its base. Both Field Marshals von Rundstedt and Model urged Hitler to strengthen the Seventh Army, and General von Manteuffel made a last effort at the Reichschancellery on December 2nd to get at least a Panzergrenadier division for Brandenberger, whose advance was crucial for the protection of his own south flank. But Hitler refused. Any additional unit given the Seventh Army would be either one less unit available to propel the 2 panzer armies swiftly over the Meuse, or one less unit for the second wave he was counting upon to exploit the crossings of the Meuse all the way to Antwerp. That left General Brandenberger at 50, a bald, bespectacled, paunchy man who was a conservative but experienced commander with 2 corps headquarters, 4 divisions, 30 assault guns, 427 artillery pieces and rocket projectors, and no tanks, more a reinforced corps than a field army. In Brandenberger's view, the best he could hope to accomplish was to make a penetration with 1 corps on his south wing in the vicinity of the border town of Echternach and erect a defensive barrier about 8 miles short of Luxembourg City. With the other corps, he would penetrate close along the flank of the 5th Panzer Army, gaining as much impetus as possible from that army's advance, and drive, if fortune smiled, as far as the region south of Bastogne, there to assume defensive positions facing south toward Arlon. Getting to the Meuse, Brandenberger reasoned, was chimerical. On the other hand, as elsewhere in the Ardennes, the forces available to the Seventh Army, however limited, dwarfed the defensive strength immediately available to the opposing American units. Each of the 2 divisions of the 85th Corps next to the 5th Panzer Army faced a single battalion of the 28th Division's 109th Infantry on the west bank of the Our River, 7 battalions against 1, while one of the 2 divisions of the 80th Corps faced an armoured infantry battalion of the 9th Armoured Division, and the other a regiment of the 4th Division, the 12th Infantry, both of which held positions on the west bank of the Schur River below the juncture of the Our and the Schur. Yet in that sector, as in few other places, there were some American reserves. With the arrival of the 60th Armoured Infantry Battalion to gain battle experience, the 109th Infantry had been able to pull a battalion into reserve, and the 28th Division's commander, General Cotta, had afforded the regiment a medium tank company of the 707th Tank Battalion and a company of towed tank destroyers. As a component of the 9th Armoured Division's Combat Command A, the Armoured Infantry Battalion had the backup of the Combat Command's Medium Tank Battalion and a company of self-propelled tank destroyers. Although the commander of the 4th Division, General Barton, had 2 more regiments, both were holding elongated fronts farther south, and since Barton had no way of knowing German intentions, he would be reluctant to draw on those regiments until he determined the extent of the German attack. Barton also had a self-propelled tank destroyer battalion and a medium tank battalion, but in the wake of the hard fighting in the Hurtgen forest, both were far under strength, and even those vehicles that survived the forest fighting needed repairs and overhauls. In artillery, the defenders were to have at first less than a fourth of the strength available to the Germans. The 109th Infantry had its usual light 105 howitzer battalion, plus the 28th Division's General Support 155 battalion, which Kota had allotted the regiment because of the possibility of a German move against Luxembourg City. The 60th Armoured Infantry Battalion had an armoured field artillery battalion with self-propelled 105 howitzers in support, and the 12th Infantry its usual 105 howitzer battalion. General Barton also had his organic 155 howitzers and 2 Corps Field Artillery battalions, but those were positioned farther south, where the infantry's lines were even thinner than in the 12th Infantry sector. Of the 2 divisions of the 85th Corps commanded by General der Infanterie Baptist Nice, the more ambitious assignment went to the 5th Parachute Division on the north wing. Hoping to benefit from the rapid advance expected of the Panzer Lehr Division just to the north, the paratroopers in reality, mostly recently converted Luftwaffe ground troops, were to cross the Wiltz River, in effect, a southward extension of the Clerve, a goal expected to be reached by the end of the first day. They would then continue west, bypassing the 28th Division's headquarters town of Wiltz, and finally form blocking positions south of Bastogne. The 352d Volksgrenadier Division was to cross the Our a little farther south, seize dominating ground in the angle formed by juncture of the Our and the Schur, and push on toward the westward reaches of the Schur and the towns of Diekirch and Ettelbruck. Having crossed the Schur, the troops were to build defensive positions on the heights beyond. One of the newly formed 13,000-man Volksgrenadier divisions, made up mainly of converted airmen, but with a sprinkling of shore-based sailors, the 352d had been holding the line in the Eifel for several weeks, but had pulled back during the night of December 12th to prepare for the attack, which explained why nobody fired when Elise Dell set off a mine, and why the patrol of the 109th Infantry that crossed the hour before daylight on the 15th at Vianden found nobody in the pillboxes. Most of the 7th Army's skimpy allotment of assault guns was with those 2 divisions. Reflecting the greater ambition of the objectives assigned the 85th Corps over those assigned the 7th Army's other corps, 2/3 of the artillery pieces and rocket projectors fired their preparation in the 109th Infantry sector. Most of the fire hit headquarters towns and artillery positions in the rear, little of it against the forward infantry. So accurate was the shelling in Diekirch, where the regiment's reserve battalion was billeted, that men of the battalion's intelligence section went looking for an observer in their midst. As the story reached the troops, possibly apocryphal, they found a radio antenna erected over a cobbler's shop, and inside, operating a radio set, a good-looking blonde. Are all female spies blonde and good-looking? The word passed among the troops that she was summarily shot. Little of the snow that was present in northern reaches of the Ardennes was to be found that morning in central Luxembourg, for what had been snow farther north had fallen as rain and sleet there, but the same kind of heavy fog that obscured German movement elsewhere hugged the ground. Although the 7th Army had a few of the big searchlights used farther north, few American troops remarked on any effects. In the fog and darkness, the Americans saw nothing of the Germans crossing the Our in assault boats, and at Vianden, engineers of the 5th Parachute Division were on top of the roadblock maintained outside the Hotel Heinz before men of Lieutenant Prezenka's the 1st and R platoon awoke to their presence. Everybody in the little platoon was either killed or captured. The German advance against the extreme northern wing of the 109th Infantry reflected orders to the paratroopers to sidestep opposition wherever possible. One column bypassed Company F, which was dug in on a ridge commanding a meandering road leading from Vianden, and toiled slowly toward the southern reaches of the Skyline Drive. Another force entered the undefended village of Wolsdorf, a little over a mile behind Vianden, which prompted the 2D Battalion commander to commit a company to dig in facing the village. When the paratroopers began to emerge from Wolsdorf in late afternoon, heading toward the 2D Battalion's headquarters village of Brandenburg, the commander of the 109th Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel James E. Rudder, who had only recently taken over the regiment after having led a ranger battalion ashore on D-Day in Normandy and later in the Hurtgen Forest, sent a company from the regimental reserve to help the headquarters troops hold Brandenburg. The other of the 2D Battalion's forward units, Company E in Foren, almost due south of Vianden, astride the principal highway leading down to the valley of the Schur and thence to Diekirch, had more difficulty. Both the 5th Parachute Division and the adjacent 352d Volksgrenadier Division needed either that highway or a secondary road that also passed through the village. Paratroopers passing to the north, Volksgrenadiers to the south, soon isolated Foren, and Company E radio failed. Paratroopers and Volksgrenadiers alike poked at the village through the day, but possibly because it lay on the interdivisional boundary, they made no coordinated assault. At the end of the day, Company E was still in place. Volksgrenadiers passing south of Foren nevertheless posed a considerable threat, for they soon held 2 nearby undefended villages, one on the main highway leading down to the Schur Valley, the other on a side road also providing access to the valley. Should they reach the valley road, they would cut the supply route to the 3D Battalion's positions in the angle formed by confluence of the Our and the Schur. Having taken advantage of the fog, German patrols had already begun to fire on one of the batteries of the 108th Field Artillery Battalion alongside the valley road. Shortly after midday, Colonel Rudder committed a company from his reserve battalion, supported by a platoon of medium tanks, to drive the Germans from the 2 villages and later reinforce those with the final company of his reserve. Among the last to be committed was Company B 2nd Platoon, accompanied by 2 Sherman tanks. The platoon leader, First Lieutenant James V. Christie, had seen action before, but as was the case in all the rifle companies of the 109th Infantry, any of his men had only recently reached the front as replacements. One of those was Tech. Sergeant Stanislaus Wieschik, one of hundreds of non-commissioned officers combed from support units, given a few days of refresher training, and put into the infantry. Over Wieschik's protest, "Listen, Lieutenant, I got these stripes for running a consolidated mess hall at Camp Fan in Texas." Christie had made him his platoon sergeant, second in command. Either he did the job his stripes at that point called for, or he would lose them. By nightfall, the platoon and its 2 supporting tanks had advanced well along the road from the Schur Valley toward Foren. In the darkness, it was eerie moving forward with flashes of artillery fire lighting the night sky in seemingly every direction. The men were tired, hungry, and upset over the losses they had taken during the day. Lieutenant Christie could sense the uneasiness of the soldiers. The lead tank suddenly came to a halt. Going forward, Christie found the tank commander determined to proceed not another inch without riflemen in front of him to guard against anti-tank rockets from Panzerfausts. Turning to Sergeant Wieschik, Christie told him to get a squad out front. "The guys have had more than enough today," responded Wieschik. "They won't go." The young lieutenant gulped, but he quickly turned to the commander of the tank. "How many men do you want in front of this tank to move it?" The tank commander said 1 good soldier would do. "You have got him," said Christie. "Follow me." With pounding heart, Lieutenant Christie stepped out in front of the Sherman and started walking into the darkness. He had gone only a short way and the tank had scarcely begun to rumble forward behind him when Christie made out a figure on his left. It was Wieschik. "Okay, Lieutenant," said Wieschik, "you made your point." Close behind him was the entire first squad. Before digging in for the night, the 2 reserve companies made it to the fringes of the 2 villages, thereby blocking both roads leading to the valley of the Schur, but without dislodging the Germans from the villages. Company E remained isolated in Foren, and Colonel Rudder had committed the last of his infantry reserve. Meanwhile, against the high ground in the angle formed by the confluence of the Our and the Schur, German infantry, having crossed the Our unobserved in the fog and darkness, had attacked positions of the 3D Battalion early in the morning. As defensive positions went in the Ardennes, those were fairly compact. 2 rifle companies dug in on steep bluffs overlooking the Our and the 3rd in reserve, while the battalion's right flank drew protection from the deep cut of the Schur. To the waiting Americans, the attacking Germans appeared to be fanatically hopped up. Many of them charged wildly, screaming and firing their weapons until killed or wounded. Whether courage drunk from bottles or some other kind, it was undeniably courage and drew grudging admiration from the defenders, but it went for naught. In what General Brandenberger was later to call very bloody fighting, the Germans made no dent in the 3D Battalion's line, while artillery fire observed from the forward positions pummeled them throughout the day along the banks of the Our, seriously interfering with attempts to put in a bridge just downstream from Vianden. As the first day of the attack against the 109th Infantry came to an end, Colonel Rudder saw no cause for alarm. While there was no doubt that the attack was in considerable strength, Rudder considered his regiment to be in a good position with a distinct advantage of terrain. The Germans had yet to employ any tanks or assault guns, and Rudder still had the bulk of a company of medium tanks on hand. Although Company E remained isolated in Foren, isolation on the battlefield held few concerns for an officer with Rudder's background in the Rangers, and a renewal of the counterattack by his reserve battalion should remedy Company E situation with the coming of a new day. Men of the 9th Armoured Division's 60th Armoured Infantry Battalion held on a high plateau between the Schur River in the north and a little stream known as the Urns Noir Black Urns in the south. With an eye to tourism, Luxembourg officials called the terrain to the south La Petite Suisse, Little Switzerland. The name denotes no great heights, but instead spectacular sandstone rock formations in the deep gorge of the Little Urns Noir, formations carved by the elements over the centuries, sometimes isolated and looking like misshapen chimneys, elsewhere clustered like the ruins of some grotesque fortress. Except for the verdant forest cloaking the gorge, the officials might also have called it the Wild West, for to many an American soldier familiar with the rock formations on the buttes and mesas of southwestern states, it looked like a setting for cowboys and Indians. The gorge lies some 300 to 500 feet below the surrounding tableland, and in some places its walls are sheer cliffs. Unlike the deep cut of the Schur River, which afforded flank protection for the 109th Infantry's 3D Battalion, the gorge of the Urns Noir did nothing to strengthen the armoured infantrymen's positions, for 3 roads cut perpendicularly across it. One of them led directly into the rear of the American positions at Beaufort, where the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth W. Collins, had his headquarters in a castle dating from the 12th century that Victor Hugo, who spent time in the region as an exile, called a vision. Farther up the gorge, the other 2 roads led toward firing positions of the 3D Armoured Field Artillery Battalion. Furthermore, responsibility for the Urns Noir belonged to the neighbouring unit, the 4th Division's 12th Infantry, and as Colonel Collins knew, the 12th Infantry was so overextended that only a small outpost was in a position to block German movement up the gorge. Collins also was considerably concerned about his north flank, for more than a mile separated his men from the closest positions of the 109th Infantry. To cover that gap, or at least to give the alarm, he had only a squad positioned in the settlement of Hogenberg, looking down on the German village of Wollendorf and the juncture of the Aue and the Schur, the spot where American armour in September had crossed and headed for Bitburg. Yet Collins's main positions were compact and located atop steep bluffs with good fields of fire into the valley of the Schur. Like both forward battalions of the 109th Infantry, the 60th Armoured Infantry Battalion faced 7 enemy battalions, an entire division, the 276th Volksgrenadier, recently arrived from Poland, where it had been rehabilitated after disastrous losses in Normandy. Most of the new men were young conscripts who had received adequate basic training, but they had neither tanks nor assault guns. The division's objective was somewhat indefinite, merely to cross the Schur, annihilate the Americans who stood in the way, and gain high ground to the southwest from which to constitute part of a blocking position to be formed by the 80th Corps facing in the direction of Luxembourg City. Just where that line was to be established depended upon how much ground the 2 divisions of the 80th Corps were able to gain, but they hoped to reach a point 8 miles from Luxembourg City. Contrary to what the Americans were to perceive, the capital of Luxembourg was not an objective. Neither were the transmitters of Radio Luxembourg, one of Europe's most powerful stations, located just over halfway between the frontier and Luxembourg City at Junglinster, although to the American commanders both seemed likely targets. Since the bulk of the 7th Army's artillery supported the north wing of the attack, the preparation in the sector of the 60th Armoured Infantry Battalion was less than awesome, about 1,000 rounds, most of which fell on the battalion headquarters village of Beaufort and on the artillery positions farther back. Yet that was sufficient to knock out all telephone lines within the battalion. The first Germans the armoured infantrymen spotted early on December 16th appeared to constitute nothing more than patrols, but by late morning, that first impression had proven to be deceptive. When the fog lifted, the men could see swarms of Germans crossing the Schur near Wollendorf and downstream near the village of Dillingen, just down the bluff from the foxholes of Company A. Supporting artillery took both sites under heavy fire, But still the Germans continued to cross. The little outpost at Hogenberg was quickly overwhelmed, and the men of both forward companies were soon aware that the wooded draws leading to their positions were thick with Germans. Shortly before midday, an attack launched from the houses of Dillingen forced back a platoon of Company A, but the battalion's reserve company moved forward quickly from Beaufort to restore the line. As night fell, except for the outpost at Hogenberg, the 60th Armoured Infantry's positions were intact. The battalion commander, Colonel Collins, nevertheless continued to worry about the possibility of the Germans moving up the roads from the Ernst Noir and isolating his companies and their supporting howitzers. The commander of the 7th Army, General Brandenberger, considered the 212th Volksgrenadier Division the most capable of his 4 divisions, which was why he assigned the division the task of anchoring the army's south flank and why he withheld 1 regiment as an army reserve. Burned out in fighting on the Eastern Front, the division had begun rebuilding in September around a cadre of experienced junior officers and non-commissioned officers, and with conscripts judged to be better than average, including a considerable number of 17-year-olds. Yet the division had only 4 assault guns and the usual handicap posed by horse-drawn artillery. As for the American 4th Infantry Division, having arrived in Luxembourg only at the end of the first week in December, it had had little time in which to reorganize and absorb replacements for the 5,000 casualties incurred in the Hurtgen forest. All rifle companies were still short by at least 40 men, the size of a platoon, and they would have been even more under strength had not General Barton, concerned about a possible enemy raid on Luxembourg City, recalled the men who had been in rest centers to the rear. The German artillery barrage that began at 5:30 a.m. on the 16th struck only the division's northernmost regiment, the 12th Infantry, and most of the shells fell on company and battalion command posts and artillery positions. While heavy and surprising for what was supposed to be a quiet sector, the preparation was hardly enough to create much alarm in old hands who had experienced German shelling since the early days in Normandy. It was nevertheless sufficient to knock out most telephone lines forward of the battalion headquarters, or else, as most men believed, German patrols deliberately cut them. Concealed by the fog and darkness, the Volksgrenadiers crossed the Schur on both sides of Echternach, a medieval town of some 5,000 people, all previously evacuated on the west bank of the Schur, almost at the center of the 12th Infantry's positions. Having defended the west wall opposite the sector for several weeks, the Volksgrenadiers had plotted the American positions accurately and moved swiftly to encircle the outposts. Southwest of Echternach, the Germans overran a squad-sized outpost, each of companies 1 and L, but the men in other companies managed to fall back on the main positions in the villages of Osweiler and Dickweiler, located in rolling high farm country about a mile back from the Schur. In Echternach itself, all 3 of Company E rifle platoons in widely separated positions came under fire from Germans who had infiltrated nearby buildings, as did the company headquarters in a hat factory on the southern edge of town. At the village of Lauterborn, just over a mile behind Echternach, where Company G provided a backup position along the main highway to Luxembourg City, all 3 of the company's squad-sized outposts were cut off, but to a man they were eventually to make their way to safety, some after wandering behind German lines for up to 4 days. The effect of the German infiltration was far more damaging against the outposts of Company F3, were located northwest of Echternach, near the village of Berdorf, on a lip of high ground overlooking the Schur, or just back from it in farm buildings, all held in platoon strength. The 4th, manned by an understrength squad, was in the gorge of the Ernst Noir, near the point where the first of the perpendicular roads crossing the gorge led to Beaufort. All 4 outposts fell, everybody either killed or captured except for 2 men from the outpost along the Ernst Noir, and 13 who had gone on a routine contact patrol. 4 of those men were also captured later in the day, but the 9 others eventually made their way out, some after playing cowboys and Indians with the Germans among the big rock formations in the valley of the Ernst Noir. By late morning, the Germans had surrounded all 5 of the forward companies, Company 1 in Dickweiler, Company L in Osweiler, Company G in Lauterborn, which had the effect of cutting off Company E in Echternach, and what was left of Company F in a resort hotel 100 yards outside Berdorf. Yet their presence still posed considerable difficulties for the Germans, for the American positions controlled every road leading into the 12th Infantry sector, except that up the valley of the Ernst Noir. Shortly before noon, General Barton granted the regimental commander, Col Robert H. Chance, authority to commit his reserve battalion, and released to him a platoon of medium tanks of the attached 70th Tank Battalion and 2 platoons of the battalion's light tanks, rushed forward from assignment guarding Radio Luxembourg. Chance sent 1 company with some of the tanks marching on Burdorf to relieve the men of Company F in the nearby hotel, and another with the rest of the tanks toward Lauterborn to relieve Company G. The force advancing on Burdorf failed to make it, encountering strong resistance near the village and precipitating a fight that was destined to continue well into the night. The force moving on Lauterborn did better. Overcoming resistance on a hill just outside the village, it continued forward, and as night began to fall, reached a mill on the edge of Lauterborn. There, the force rescued a small group of Americans who through the afternoon had undergone what had been, at best, an unnerving experience. As the Germans advanced on Lauterborn, about 40 of them captured 15 Americans manning an outpost built around a 57 mm anti-tank gun. Continuing to advance, the Germans marched the Americans up the road in front of them, heading toward the mill house that was occupied, although the Germans had no way of knowing it by Company G command group. Alongside the road outside the mill house stood a low stone wall. As the prisoners passed behind the wall, they had cover, but the Germans were still in the open. The men of the command group opened fire. Armed only with rifles and a single bar, the command group nevertheless managed to keep the Germans pinned to the ground until the relief force arrived. At Osweiler and Dickweiler, the 2 forward companies of the 3D Battalion held their own. At Osweiler, the Germans fell back after making an assault that cost them 50 men, and even though 20 Germans managed later to get into a few of the houses, they pulled out after dark. At Dickweiler, the Germans made only a half-hearted effort against the village until late afternoon, by which time the battalion commander, Major Herman R. Rice, had sent 15 men from his reserve company riding 3 medium tanks to the village. As 2 German companies attacked, everybody held his fire until the Germans were so close that the tank commanders feared their tanks might be hit by Panzerfausts. When at last the infantry company commander signaled fire, the effect was devastating. A German company commander and 50 of his men were killed. Another company commander and 35 men surrendered, and the other survivors fell back in disorder. 100 yards east of Burdorf, the commander of Company F, First Lieutenant John L. Leake, had established his headquarters in the Park Hotel, built in the early 1930s when tourism was beginning to develop into a major industry in Luxembourg. As the hotel's brochures proclaimed, the Park Hotel occupied a site isolé, a high open plateau only a few hundred yards from one of the more spectacular rock formations in the gorge of the Urnes Noires, known as the Île du Diable, and featured both confort moderne and cuisine distinguée. Since Leake and the members of his command group had to make do with U.S. Army victuals prepared by their own less-than-accomplished chefs, they could provide no testimony to the distinguished cuisine, but they could attest to the modern comforts of the beds and the plumbing, and the isolated site afforded excellent fields of fire. Since all communication had failed, Lieutenant Leake had no early knowledge of the tragic fate of his outposts, located a mile from the hotel, but in the wake of the early morning shelling, he was markedly concerned about a lack of communications with his battalion headquarters and the artillery. Since his executive officer, First Lieutenant Richard McConnell, was planning to go to the rear to dispose of cash left over from paying the men, he urged McConnell to hurry back with the company's radio, an SCR 300, which had been left for repair. McConnell was about ready to leave by jeep, but was waiting for the first sergeant to complete the morning report when a soldier came running up. It was a man from the crew of a nearby 57 mm anti-tank gun. Did anybody know anything about a column of troops marching up the hill from the direction of the Ham Farm? Almost simultaneously, men manning an observation post on top of the hotel called down that they could see a column of troops approaching. Rushing to the roof, Lieutenant Leake saw Germans advancing, one file on either side of the road. At Leake's urging, Lieutenant McConnell and his driver took off in their jeep immediately, wheels spinning under orders to report to battalion the approach of a possible enemy patrol, and to hurry back with the SCR 300. As Lieutenant Leake was soon aware, what he had seen was no German patrol, but the vanguard of an entire battalion. The bulk of the battalion bypassed the Park Hotel and entered the unoccupied village of Burdorf, while the group seen from the observation post moved into a cluster of houses just short of the hotel and opened fire. Inside, Leek, 3 other officers, and 55 men took refuge. Other than their rifles, they had only a few bars, 1.50 caliber machine gun, and little reserve ammunition. Such extra ammunition as the company had on hand was in a small shed in the garden, which was impossible to reach in the face of fire from the German-held houses. 2 men who had been working in the shed were trapped there. As the Americans took up firing positions at the hotel's windows, the Germans were unable to advance. Meanwhile, those in the village of Burdorf moved about freely until Company F First Sergeant Gervais Willis placed a bar in a window near the entrance to the hotel and opened fire on a crossroads at the edge of the village. Willis reckoned that he killed 8 men before the Germans began to respect his marksmanship and avoid the crossroads. Lieutenant McConnell had in the meantime reached battalion headquarters in a village a few miles back and found the company's radio fully repaired. Conscious of Lieutenant Leek's urgent need for the radio, he dismissed his other mission of getting rid of the excess money and with his driver, CKPL John Mandichak, headed back for the Park Hotel. As they reached the crossroads in Burdorf, Germans at close range opened a hail of fire. Mandichak dived out his side of the jeep and ran into a barn, where he hid under a pile of hay until nightfall and then slipped away, the beginning of a 7-day odyssey that was eventually to bring him to safety in American lines. Diving out the other side of the jeep, McConnell ran into a house, but the Germans spotted him and he had to surrender. A German sergeant took McConnell's bag of money, examined the contents, then handed it back with a smile. Having sold newspapers as a youth in Miami, McConnell had picked up some Yiddish and found that he could converse after a fashion with the sergeant. His company commander was with a German group that had just taken the Park Hotel, said the sergeant. He was sending the lieutenant there. At the point of a rifle, McConnell started up a straight exposed road leading directly to the hotel's entrance. When McConnell and his guard got within 25 yards of it, McConnell realized that the German sergeant was wrong. Those were American soldiers at the windows. "Do not shoot," McConnell shouted. "They will shoot me." Since it was obvious to the German soldier too that Americans, not Germans, held the hotel, he used his prisoner as a shield and backed down the road to Burdorf. At that point, the German sergeant saw a chance to use his prisoner to engineer surrender of the Americans in the hotel. Summoning his squad and with McConnell in the lead at the point of a gun, he headed up the road. As the group got close to the hotel, one of the soldiers yelled from a window, "Are all those your prisoners?" McConnell shouted back, "Hell no, I am the prisoner." Lieutenant Leek was momentarily at a loss to know what to do, but he made up his mind quickly and shouted his order to his men loud enough for McConnell to hear, "Pick your targets. It's just like shooting ducks in a gallery. Squeeze 'em off and do not waste ammo." McConnell understood, but for the benefit of the Germans, he shouted back, "Do not shoot." Then he added, "And do not miss." At one of the windows, CPL Robert Hancock drew a bead on the German closest to McConnell. He could see the lieutenant's shoulder and the Jerry's left pocket he held on the pocket. At Lieutenant Leek's signal, everybody fired at once. The first volley dropped all but 2 of the Germans. Along with McConnell, those 2, one of them, the sergeant, ran behind a nearby building that shielded them from the hotel, but exposed them to the 2 men from Company F who had been trapped in the supply shed. Each choosing a target, the 2 men fired, killing 1 German but only wounding the sergeant. The man firing at the sergeant was new to the front and reluctant to kill anybody. He had consciously aimed at the sergeant's buttocks. "Now," said McConnell to the sergeant, "you had better give up," to which the sergeant responded, "I give up." McConnell cradled the German in his arms, an act that presumably kept the Germans in nearby houses from opening fire, and took him into the hotel. There, he and the others were careful to treat their prisoner with consideration, for they were all too conscious that before long their roles might be reversed. As the afternoon wore on, that appeared to be ever more likely, for even though the Germans in the nearby houses attempted no assault, German artillery pummeled the hotel, caving in the attic and part of the 3rd floor, and there was no sign of a relief force coming to the rescue. Just after nightfall, there was the sound of heavy firing on the far side of Burdorf, which indicated that somebody was trying to get through, but it eventually died away. By early evening of December 16th, the 12th Infantry continued to hold all its positions except those outposts overrun in the first German surge during the early morning fog and darkness, but it was clear that the Germans were continuing to build their strength. So intense was the pressure against Companies 1 and L at Osweiler and Dickweiler that the regimental commander, Colonel Chance, sent the last company of his reserve battalion to the 3D Battalion's command post to be ready to move to the two villages early the next day. The companies had no choice but to hold, for in mid-afternoon the 4th Division commander, Tubby Barton, as West Point classmates had long ago nicknamed him, had ordered that there was to be no retrograde movement in the 12th Infantry's sector. However hard-pressed the 12th Infantry, Barton was still hesitant to call on his other two regiments for help, for there was no guarantee that the German attack was not to expand. He nevertheless took the gamble of ordering his southernmost regiment to release its reserve battalion to move north early the next morning. He also directed much of the artillery supporting other parts of his front to shift to positions from which to fire in support of the 12th Infantry, and from the commander of the 9th Armoured Division, he got the promise of a company of medium tanks to arrive the next morning from that division's CCA and augment his own badly depleted tank battalion. He also alerted the 4th Engineer Battalion and the 4th Reconnaissance Troop to be ready for commitment at an hour's notice. On the German side, the commander of the 7th Army, General Brandenberger, viewed the day's developments with some equanimity. Although he lamented the fact that American artillery fire had prevented installing even one bridge to enable his few assault guns to enter the fight a mile to the north, the Panzer Lehr Division refused the use of its bridge, pronounced too busy. There were positive points as well. While it was true that the 5th Parachute Division had fallen far short of crossings over the Wiltz River, it was also true that each of the Army's 4 divisions had penetrated the American front at one point or another, and Brandenberger perceived the failure to advance farther as attributable to his enemy's local reserves, all of which he assumed had been committed by the end of the day. At that point, it was a matter of making the breakthrough a thorough one before the enemy had a chance to bring up stronger reserves. What Brandenberger could not know was that he was destined to meet a stronger reserve sooner than he anticipated. A few minutes before midnight, the commander of the 8th Corps, General Middleton, telephoned General Barton. At daybreak the next morning, said Middleton, a combat command of the 10th Armoured Division was to leave an assembly area in the 3rd Army's sector, only 35 miles from the 12th Infantry's positions. Barton was to have the use of that combat command.